fame was Elgar's now. Even after the Enigma variations were performed, he was still giving violin lessons to schoolgirls, but now he was England's best-known composer, regarded as the greatest for 200 years, and in 1904, in his 47th year, he became Sir Edward. He moved to a larger house in Hereford, Plas Gwyn, and there he began to compose a whole series of his greatest works. One of the first of these was a work for strings, the Introduction and Allegro. On a holiday in Wales in 1901, he'd heard a choir singing on a hillside and had sketched a theme. 3 years later, he had a similar experience in the Wye Valley, and he put this into music in the Introduction and Allegro. It's really a tribute to that sweet borderland where I've made my home, he said. In the year of his 50th birthday, 1907, Elgar at last began to compose a symphony. It's a work on a huge scale, brilliantly and opulently scored. It made such an impact on musicians and the public that nearly 100 performances were given in its first year of existence, at a time, remember, when there was no radio and recording was in its infancy. All Elgar is in the First Symphony, the public, confident Elgar and the secret, private Elgar. In the second movement, there's a famous passage where the music seems to glint and shimmer like sunshine on water. Perhaps he was thinking of his boyhood, because when rehearsing this section, he told the London Symphony Orchestra, "Play this like something you hear down by the river." After the phenomenal success of the symphony, The same kind of triumphal acclaim greeted his next work in 1910, a large-scale violin concerto written for and dedicated to the legendary Fritz Kreisler. The passionate music is like a love song, but it also seems to be full of the countryside. Most of it was written in Hereford, and some of it at the house of a friend near Maidenhead, to whom he said, "This concerto is good, awfully emotional, too emotional, but I love it. It's full of romantic feeling." Though he couldn't know it, the violin concerto was the last really great success Elgar was to have. In 1911, his second symphony was coldly received. Yet perhaps that was understandable. The first performance was a month before George V's coronation. London was in jubilant mood. Britannia ruled the waves. England was a land of hope and glory, or so it seemed. Yet here was this symphony by the composer of Land of Hope and Glory, which ended sadly and quietly like a sunset, like the end of an era, like the end of a way of life. That elegiac mood was very much Elgar's at this period. He had all the fame and honour he could have desired, yet he frequently said they meant nothing. Like most creative artists, he was a prey to moods of black despair and pessimism. He knew the agony of creation as well as the ecstasy. In 1912, he went to live in Hampstead at a big mansion he called Severn House, and there he finished his choral ode, The Music Makers. To a very dear friend, he confided his depression. "Yesterday was the most awful day which inevitably occurs when I've completed a work. It has always been so, but this time I promised myself a day. It would be lovely weather. I should have open air and sympathy and everything to mark the end of the work, to get away from the labour and dream over it happily. But Alice was away, and I wandered alone on the heath. It was bitterly cold. I loathed the world, came back to the house empty and cold. How I hated having written anything. I longed to destroy the work of my hands, all wasted. World losers and world forsakers for ever and ever. How true it is. The end of an era which Elgar had foretold in the Second Symphony came with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. He wrote several patriotic works to match the euphoric mood of the first year of the war, but as the years passed, he came to see ever more clearly that the world, and especially his world, would never be the same again. "I cannot do my real work with the awful shadow over us," he said. "Everything good and nice and clean and fresh and sweet is far away, never to return." He was ill. He was tired of London and longed for the countryside. His wife found a thatched cottage in the heart of Sussex, Brinkwells, near Fittleworth. There, in 1918, he was able to work again and composed 3 pieces of chamber music. Again it was the landscape which inspired him. He was fascinated by a clump of dead trees which were connected with a local legend and were a sinister sight in the evening light. At Brinkwells in the autumn, Elgar enjoyed chopping wood and making bonfires, watching the smoke curl up into the trees. He began to write a cello concerto. The colours are muted, the mood is wistful. It was autumn with Elgar, too. Never glad, confident morning again. This was the music of disillusion and regret. "If ever you're on the Malvern Hills after I'm dead, and you hear someone whistling this tune," he said to one of his friends, "don't be afraid. It's only me." 1920, Elgar's wife died. He grew lonelier in London and went back to live in Worcestershire, restlessly moving house several times, walking with his dogs in the lanes he knew so well. He conducted his music at concerts throughout the country, and especially at the Three Choirs Festival every year, but he composed very little, and most of that was from sketches made years earlier. He went to the races and said he no longer had any interest in music. He felt that the times were out of joint for him, and compared with the moderns, he seemed to some people a very old-fashioned composer. In 1933, he became seriously ill. An operation was unsuccessful, and for 4 months he lay on his deathbed. He formed a wish to be buried at the confluence of the rivers Severn and Teme. Time and again his thoughts turned to the river. "I lie here hour after hour thinking of our beloved Teme," he wrote, "surely the most beautiful river that ever was." In January 1934, exactly a month before he died, he supervised a recording session of his music by special post office line from his bed in Worcester to the studio in London. One of the pieces was the Woodland Interlude, and he asked for it to be repeated twice. It was probably the last music he heard. "The trees are singing my music, or have I sung theirs?"